So my name is Ellen Holstein. I'm the Community Program Manager at Pierce Cedar Creek Institute. And I want to welcome you all to Stories in the Sky tonight. We're doing this with the Hastings Public Library in Hastings, Michigan, as well as John Hawkins, who's in Wisconsin. So we're all over the place tonight. It's a great night. So one program that we are going to be using tonight is an online planetarium program. It is called Stellarium. And this program is a free program, so if you are interested in it, you can go online, go to stellarium.org, and you can actually download this program right onto your computer and use it yourself. So this is a program that's fun to use, and you'll get to see a little bit of it tonight. All right, so let me stop sharing my screen for just a second. And I am going to introduce our speaker in just a second, but before I do so, I need to get up Stellarium. So give me 1 second. You'll get to see what Stellarium looks like. So this is Stellarium. As I said, it's an online planetarium program. And right now in Michigan, so I have set our Stellarium program to Kalamazoo, Michigan. And you can set it to wherever you want to set this program. You can set it to Egypt, you can set it to France, wherever you want to look at the night sky. But right now in Kalamazoo, Michigan, our sky is not so night. So we are actually going to fast forward time. This is the only time you can do that, right? We're going to fast forward time. So this would be 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 10 o'clock. We're going to make it nighttime in Kalamazoo, Michigan, or wherever you are. Which brings us to John Hawkins. Is our storyteller tonight. He is also a teacher, originally from Hastings, Michigan, but now in Wisconsin, and a very much lover of stars in the sky and their stories. And so I have a question for John before he gets started. John, my question for you is, how did you get interested in stars and their stories?
Well, that would be the fault of my mom, who got me started in Greek mythology on a Saturday morning when I was in 3rd grade with the story of Hades and Persephone. And then learning about the myths, I learned about the constellations, and the two came together like peanut butter and chocolate.
Awesome. All right, John, take it away with your stories in the sky.
All right, so the specific stories we're going to be talking about are myths. And myths are stories that we tell to explain the world and how it works. And all the different cultures in the history of the world have had their own sets of myths. But if you're talking about the night sky, then most likely you're going to be talking about the stories of the Greeks and the Romans. Around 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, the ancient Greeks dominated the area around the Mediterranean Sea. And their thoughts and their philosophies spread far and wide. Then the Romans came in and took over. And when the Romans came in and took over, they also took over the stories. They took over some of those sciences, and they spread it even farther using their empire, because empires are great for spreading things, good and bad. And one of the things that the Romans loved about the ancient Greeks were their stories. And so what they did is they basically took all the Greek stories and changed the names, kind of like a high schooler cheating on an essay. They turned Zeus into Jupiter, they turned Cronus into Saturn, and all the way down the line. And they took those stories and they spread them all through the world. And those stories dominated the region and still are pretty dominant today in a lot of science and in a lot of art. Now, one thing to understand when you're talking about the stories of the Greeks and Romans is they weren't really at the time aware that the Earth was a sphere floating through space, spinning around madly. They had more what I call the snow globe model, where they believed that the Earth was a flat surface, covered with mountains, rivers, and all the things that we love where we live. And over the top of that flat surface was a crystal dome. And that crystal dome held back the waters of the heavens. And if that dome ever falls, or if the gods open up the gates on it, we all get washed away. So you have that flat saucer, you have a river called Oceanus as the rim of the saucer, and then a crystal dome over the top, just like a giant snow globe. And all of that snow globe was ruled over by the Olympians, the gods on Mount Olympus. And the gods were all-powerful, almighty, and almighty bored. They were bored all the time, and they used humans as their entertainment, as part of their games, like a big kid picking on a very, very little kid, or a little kid playing with ants would be more likely. And to the Olympians, the night sky was like their trophy case, because from that crystal dome, the gods would hang lights, the stars and the planets, sort of like Christmas lights in a bedroom ceiling. And it's important to note that we look up in the sky and we're lucky if we can see a handful of stars on a good day if we're in the city. But back then, there was no light pollution. So the sky was filled with stars. And there was no Netflix or Facebook to distract us. So there was a lot of time to spend looking at that night sky. And as people looked at the night sky, they started to see patterns in the stars. And the ancients believed that those patterns were there on purpose. Those constellations were the gods' way of remembering great heroes, horrible monsters, and important events. And that'll bring us to the first of our stories, because the Romans named the 4 planets that they could see with the naked eye after 4 of their most important gods: Jupiter, the god of kings; Mars, the god of war; Venus, the goddess of beauty; and Saturn, the god of agriculture, or an early god of agriculture. And right away, we get a story just from 2 of those 4. It's like a soap opera, a horror story, and an action movie all in one. Because Saturn was the father of Jupiter, and Jupiter was the king. But before Jupiter was the king, Saturn was. And you have to know that Saturn became the king by defeating his own father. And Saturn kind of saw this coming his way, and he did not want to lose the crown. And since he's pretty sure one of his kids would try to take the crown, he had a very, very efficient way of making sure none of his children would ever take over as king. He ate them. Every time his wife Rhea had a baby, she'd have the baby, Saturn would walk in, grab the baby, swallow the baby, walk out of the room. It's a very easy way to make sure that you don't have children, in case you're looking for a new technique to try today. And he swallowed his first 5 children: Juno, Ceres, Vesta, Neptune, and Pluto. 5 kids in a row. His wife Cybele gave birth. I called her Rhea before. That's her Greek name. Her Roman name was Cybele. Cybele gave birth to 5 children, 3 girls, 2 boys, and he ate them. But when it came time for her 6th child to be born, Cybele and her mother Terra, Mother Earth, hatched a plot. And they snuck that baby, the future baby Jupiter, out of the birthing suite. And one of his aunts snuck him out of the birthing suite, down off the mountain, hid him in a cave. And in that cave, he grew up, and he grew big, and he grew powerful. And he promised his grandmother, Terra, that he would free his uncles that his grandfather had imprisoned, and he would defeat Saturn. And when the time came, he did. There was a huge war between Saturn and all of his allies, the Titans, and Zeus and all of his allies, the gods, because Zeus didn't go to fight alone. He got sneaky. He was big, he was strong, but he was alone. And so what he did was he had his aunt sneak some poison into Saturn's wine cup. Saturn guzzled back the wine. His stomach got all bubbly and burbly and uncomfortable feeling, and up came each of Jupiter's brothers and sisters. And he rescued his brothers and sisters, took them off. They freed the Cyclopes, and the Cyclopes made weapons and armor for them, and then they went to war. Zeus with his spears of lightning, and Cronus with his sickle, his curved blade, the same blade he had used to defeat his own father. And a war went on for years and years, but in the end, Jupiter One, Jupiter was dominant. And so when we look at our solar system, the biggest planet of them all is Jupiter. And we're left with Jupiter, the king, and Juno, his wife. And they're the king and queen of Olympus and everything else that exists. And Jupiter, being the biggest planet, was dominant over Saturn, just like Jupiter was dominant over his father in the end. Now that leaves us Jupiter, king of the sky. And he's a huge planet, and he has at least 60 moons. On Earth, we have just the moon, Luna, but Jupiter's so big it has caught 60 moons. And most of those moons are named after women that Jupiter got involved with. And none of them are named after his actual wife. But the four moons that we can see with a set of binoculars are named Ganymede, Europa, Callisto, and Io. And all four of those are some of the most famous consorts or wives of Jupiter. I like the Greek versions of the stories better, so I will occasionally slip up and call them by the Greek names. But Jupiter was not a good husband by any stretch of the imagination. He was a horrible husband to Juno, who hadn't wanted to marry him in the first place, but he tricked her into it. And Jupiter spent a good chunk of his time not on the palace of Mount Olympus, but down on the earth with the humans, looking for people to spend time with and hiding from his wife in the process. And one day, Jupiter looked down from Mount Olympus, saw a beautiful princess named Io. And Jupiter saw Io, decided he wanted to spend some time with her, and he went down and started sweet talking her, but he thought, I don't want Juno spoiling my good time and interrupting our conversation. So, being the clever duck that he was, he summoned clouds to cover the sky and field where they're in. So when Juno looked down from Mount Olympus, she would not be able to see him and Io walking through the fields. And it worked. It covered the field. But Jupiter wasn't really thinking straight, because being a god of lightning, the clouds that he had summoned were thick, black storm clouds on a bright, sunny day. So when Juno was looking for her husband and looks down from Mount Olympus and sees a bright, sunny earth and one patch of storm clouds, she kind of knew what was happening. And so she went down to earth herself. And she came storming across because she was going to catch Zeus, Jupiter. And Jupiter heard her coming. And he panicked. And I don't know if you've ever been just about to get caught by somebody doing something you know you shouldn't have been doing in the first place, and you really don't want to get in trouble for it, and you do the first thing that comes to mind, and that first thing is kind of stupid. Well, that's what happened with Jupiter and Io. Because he hears Juno, looks at Io. Here's Juno, looks at Io. Here's Juno, cow. He turned the girl into a cow. So when Juno arrives in the field, she sees her husband standing there with a cow. And she says to him, what are you doing? Like, oh, I'm just standing here with this cow. Why are you standing here with a cow? Well, don't you agree it's a beautiful cow? And Juno looks at her husband. She says, yes, it is a beautiful cow. In fact, that cow is so beautiful, I want it. What do you mean that you want it? I want the cow. Is there anything wrong with giving your wife, your queen, a simple cow? Is there a problem, husband of mine? Like, no, it's definitely just a cow. Nothing special about it. Here you go. And so Juno took off her belt, turned it into a leash for the cow, and led poor Io, very confused, out of the field and into her special garden. And at this point, Zeus started to feel bad. He felt kind of bad for the princess. Like maybe he should do something about the fact that she's now, a cow. And so he went to one of his favorite children, one of his most useful children, Mercury, god of tricksters, messengers, and thieves. And he said to Mercury, I have a little bit of a problem. And he explained. And Mercury said, you don't have a little bit of a problem. You have a huge problem. And Jupiter said, I know, and it's worse than you think. And Mercury rubs his head. It's like, Father, how is it worse than I think? It's like, well, I tried to sneak into the garden and get the cow myself, but Hera set a guard. Father, who did she set as her guard? I mean, you can defeat anyone in battle. Like, yeah, but I need to be sneaky, and I'm not very sneaky. It's like, no, Father, you're not sneaky. Who did she put in charge? And Hera, Juno, had put her favorite servant, Argus, in charge. And Argus was a giant, and he was big and strong, but that's not what made him a problem for Zeus and Mercury. What made Argus a problem was Argus had 100 eyes all over his body. You could not sneak up on Argus. You could not sneak around Argus. You couldn't even wait for Argus to fall asleep because Argus never let more than half of his eyes fall asleep at any given time. And so Zeus had no chance of sneaking past Argus. Jupiter, again, my slip, sorry. But Mercury said, Father, don't worry, I got this. And so Jupiter sat back, rubbing his hands, waiting to see what clever, sneaky plan Mercury had come up with, because he was so sneaky. And his jaw dropped as he saw Mercury walk right up to the gate of the garden, right into the garden, and say, Hi, Argus, how are you doing today? Like, what part of sneaky don't you get, my son? But Mercury sat down right next to Argus, and Argus, very suspicious, kept several eyes on Mercury, and Mercury started telling a story. And I don't know if you've ever had a 3-year-old describe a plot of their favorite Disney movie or the weekend that they spent at their Nana's house. But it's confusing, it's jumbled, it doesn't have a beginning, it doesn't have an end, and you have no idea where anything is going or who half the people are or if the other half even exist. And that is a story that Mercury started to tell Argus. And Argus, like many uncle in the world, listening to a nephew telling a story, got bored. But he couldn't walk away because he had to guard the cow. He also couldn't tell Mercury to be quiet because Mercury was a god. And so Argus was stuck there listening. And he got bored. So bored. And slowly, one after another, Argus's eyes drooped shut. Until finally, the last of his 100 eyes drooped shut, and he fell over dead. Mercury had literally bored the giant to death, but he hadn't laid a hand on him. So there's no evidence about who had done the crime. And Mercury unties the cow, starts to walk out the garden, and he hears Juno coming. And he's like, I promise to get the cow out of the garden. I'm done. And he takes off, flying away with his winged sandals. And Juno shows up. She sees her favorite servant dead. She sees confused cow wandering out of the garden. And she gets angry. First thing she does is she summons up a swarm of horseflies to chase the poor cow. And that poor cow ran and ran from Greece all the way around into Asia Minor and across into Africa, and eventually ended up near Egypt. And poor Argus, in order to make sure that her favorite servant would never be forgotten, she plucked each of his eyes off and put it in the tail of her favorite bird, the peacock. So now whenever the peacock fans its tail feathers, you see the eyes of Argus looking out at you. And so in the sky, there's a constellation of the peacock. There's also Jupiter, the king of the gods, and one of those 60 moons orbiting him is poor, confused Io, stuck with him for eternity. Now, Io got turned into a cow and eventually became a human again, which is a better fate than happened to one of the other moon wives, Callisto, who got turned into a bear. And that's a whole separate story for another day and another time. But Jupiter is not a good husband. And as you read more and more of the stories, there are many, many people who end up suffering because he is basically a bad husband. Ellen. Oh, you're still on mute there. Sorry, surprised you.
There we go. All right. So we went through a couple of planets there. Just to, whoa. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a second and share something else so you can see where we're going with the next thing. All right. So now that John shared a couple of stories, wet your whistle a little bit for some stories. We're going to actually take a break and we're going to do a craft. We're going to make a constellation scope. Since we're talking about stories and we're talking about constellations, if you feel like joining us with this craft right now, feel free to. Otherwise, just kind of relax for a few minutes and we'll get through this craft and then John will come back with this story. So we're going to make a constellation scope. What you need is you will need the printout. Hopefully you got this in your emails, but it is a constellation guide. If you do not have that, no worries, we can get around that. You will also need some scissors, some tape or glue. I prefer tape over glue for this craft. I say 6 toilet paper rolls, but for tonight, just 1 will do. You'll need some dark colored paper or another piece of paper, some sort of cardboard or something to protect the surface of your table, and then either a push pen or a sharp pencil or even a nail. Any of those will work. And then optional is crayons. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so you guys can watch what we're doing tonight. So as I said, the first thing that you're going to need is some sort of constellation guide. And you can make your own if you want on just a piece of paper. You can make, here I've got the Great Bear, so Big Dipper, for example, the Little Bear, the Little Dipper. We've got the Flying Horse, Pegasus, the Scorpion, Scorpius, Hercules, and Cygnus the Swan, a nice summer constellation. So the first thing we need to do is we need to cut out one of those. And I think I'm going to cut out Hercules, because who doesn't like Hercules? And so there's 6 on that sheet. I'm just going to cut out one of those 6. And I'm going to cut around. And so you can see what I'm cutting. All the way around. And this will go around your paper towel roll, but we need a little bit of space around so we can tape it on when we're done with this. So when we are done cutting it out, it should look a lot like that. Eventually we'll make other slits on it, other cuts, but right now we want it kind of like this. So it looks like a circle with a little tab on the bottom. Now, remember I said you need another piece of paper as well. I like to use dark black paper, but if you don't have that, you can use also just another piece of white paper. It basically is for blocking out the sun. The darker the paper, the better. If you don't have black, if you have purple, any type of darker paper would work, but also white paper will work as well. And then you basically are going to trace around that first cutout onto that black paper. So you can do that either cutting it freestyle. Let's see if you can see this. No, that's not a good way of doing that. Let's get my white crayon for a second. So with my white crayon, you can see it a little bit better. I'm just going to trace around that just to give me a dark shape to cut out. So now I'm going to cut out that dark shape. And you'll see why we need this dark shape in just a second. As I said, it kind of looks like a circle with a little tab on the end. All right, let me get this out of the way. So you should now have the constellation guide. And if you don't have it, that's okay. But then you should also have another piece of paper that you can put right behind the other one. And I can't cut in a circle very well, but there you go. So your one side is darker, the other side is lighter. And I'm gonna tape those 2 together. So when we make our slits and when we poke our holes, they kind of stay put. If we don't do that, they tend to move around and it doesn't work as well. I've got some nice bright tape so you can see my tape marks here. I try not to tape where those cutting marks are. So I put a little bit of tape. So now you can take your scissors again. And if you see those lines right here, those dotted lines, we want to make some slits there. So I'm going to make 6 slits right on those dotted lines. And those slits are good for when we're wrapping it around the toilet paper roll. If we don't make the slits, it doesn't wrap around quite as well. And there's my 6 slits. All right, so it kind of makes it so it goes like that. And we still have our tape on there, so that way we can still keep those 2 pieces of paper together. Now the next thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to have to find, you can find a tack, you can find a push pin, you can find a sharp pencil. So if you got a really sharp pencil, that'll work. Or for some reason, I had a nail lying around, so you could try a sharp nail as well. But what you want to do is you want to put a little bit of cardboard underneath this. And you are going to, where those black dots are, you're going to push in a hole, all right? And sometimes, for some reason, it works a little better with my nail, I've noticed. It makes a bigger hole. So each one of those black dots, you're going to poke a hole. And those are going to be our star holes. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. As I said, put a piece of cardboard underneath because that really helps protect your table. All right, so you can kind of see those holes through there. It might look a little better on the other side. See those holes? So that's what you want to get. And each of those holes are going to be your stars. So if you want to make a different constellation, if you want to make your own constellation or your own stars, make whatever design you want. With that push pin, that tack, that pencil, nail if you have it around. Then we're going to take our toilet paper roll and we're going to wrap, we're going to try to put that circle of the constellation right around, and we're going to wrap the constellation around that circle, and I'm going to tape down one so you see what I'm doing. Just a minute. So I take one of those tabs and I'm going to tape it down, and I'm going to tape down each of these tabs in order. All right, so got the first one. We're going to tape down that second one, and I'll show you what I'm doing in just a minute. So let's tape down each of those tabs in order. So they're all going to cover the opening of the toilet paper roll. And sometimes it's easier to take one big piece of tape and wrap it around. If that's your way of doing it, go forth. As I said, tape tends to work better than glue. Glue will work, but you're gonna have to hold it a lot longer. And so that's why I tend to prefer tape over glue on this. But do what you've got at home, all right? And as I said, you can do this activity later if you don't feel like doing it now. If you feel like running around now, you have the wiggles in you, feel free to do that too. But I'm just gonna finish taping this up for just a second. I like to use lots of tape so things don't come off. And I'll show you what it looks like. All right, so I've put some tape on that. As I said, it's nice bright yellow tape. And what you can do with this constellation, you can turn off the lights, and you can look through it with your eye and you can see what the constellation is supposed to look like in the sky. The great thing is, I also have it labeled here. So if I forget what that constellation was, I can look on that label and look again. You can also decorate your tube. If you want to have a beautiful tube, those colors and markers can come in handy and decorate your tube. The last fun thing that you can do is you can project that constellation onto a wall. You just need a flashlight. So you just shine that flashlight right through and you can project it through. Hopefully you can see that a little bit. So you can do this with all of those constellations. I will put, if you did not get the actual guide, it has the instructions as well as all of the constellations. I'm going to put it in the chat box in both Zoom as well as Facebook. But that is the craft. That's all I've got for the craft. But feel free to do all 6 of those. Feel free to just do one of those. Whatever you feel like, whatever you have time for, but it's a kind of a fun way to remember what the constellations look like. All right, so I am going to share my screen again for Stellarium and let John take it away again. All right.
All right, for the second half of this, we are going to move away from gods, and we're going to talk about heroes and monsters. And the first hero and the first monster that we're going to talk about that are in the night sky are Hercules and the Hydra. So Hercules, you probably recognize the name. He's had a bunch of movies with Dwayne Johnson, or the Disney's Hercules. Had a long-running TV show. One of the most famous Greek heroes ever. And you might not be aware of Hydra as much. The name Hydra translates into water from the ancient Greek, and it is a water serpent. Now, Hercules was the greatest of the Greek and Roman heroes. He was a demigod. He was part human, part god, part mortal, part immortal. And his immortal part came from the god Jupiter, or Zeus. And Jupiter fell in love briefly with Princess Alcmene, and she had twin sons. One was a normal person, and the other was the demigod Hercules. And Hercules was not liked by Juno. Juno was not happy to have Hercules running around, a great hero, coming from her husband and not from her. And when you look at the picture of that overlapped on that constellation, you'll see that Hercules is wrapped up in what looks like several snakes, but in fact, it is only one snake. Because Hercules committed a crime. And the crime wasn't actually his fault. It was like the ultimate frame-up. Hera, or Juno, had spent a good chunk of his life trying to set him up, trying to get him in trouble, trying to get him killed off. And when she couldn't get him killed off, what she eventually did was drive Hercules crazy. And while he was crazy, he killed and hurt several people. And so he was given a sentence. He was sentenced to do public service. And the public service was he had to go on 10 great adventures. He had to do 10 great labors. And the human king, who was in charge of these great labors, was a miserable, shrewish, horrible, greedy little king named Eurystheus, who hated Hercules with a passion, which is exactly why Juno chose him to be the judge of the labors. The first of Hercules' labors was to kill the Nemean lion, which he did, which is why in a lot of artwork with Hercules, you'll see him wrapped in a lion skin. Sometimes the lion's skull actually pulled over his own as a helmet. And so that was his first labor. But his second labor was to slay the Hydra. Now, outside of the city of Lerna, there was a swamp. And nobody went in the swamp. Nobody. In fact, not just no people, no animals went into the swamp. And that is because a horrible serpent, a horrible monster called the Hydra, lived there. And it was a serpent, a snake, living in the water, and it was so poisonous that the venom dripped from its fangs, that the very air that came out of it as it breathed was toxic. The water it swam through became poisonous. The air above the swamp grew so poisonous that any bird that flew through the air above the swamp would drop out of the sky dead. It was a swamp devoid of animal life. And every once in a while, when the wind blew the wrong way, that same toxic cloud would sweep over Lerna itself and make people ill. So Hercules' second labor was to slay the Hydra. And so he jumped in his chariot. He brought his cousin Aeolus along with him to be his charioteer and his spear carrier. And they took off for Lerna. And they pulled up. Hercules got out. Aeolus set up camp. Hercules grabbed a sword, charged into the swamp, looking for the Hydra. And he didn't have to look long because the Hydra came looking for him. And sure enough, within moments, ripples coming through the water, the snake rears up, lashes down, tries to bite him. Snicker snack, he slices his head off with the sword, wipes off the blood on a tree, and he's about to walk away when he hears a slurping, glurping, writhing sound. Looks back over his shoulder and sees that the headless snake has reared up and now is no longer headless. It has two heads. This is not a good thing. So it lashes forward. Snicker, snack, snicker, snack. He cuts off both of those heads. 2 more heads fall to the ground. And Hercules, not being dumb, steps back, watches, and sure enough, magically, where each head got cut off, 2 more grew in its place. And it attacked him again. And eventually, Hercules, his breath running out because he'd had to take a deep breath of air before going into the swamp so he wouldn't get poisoned himself. He's running out of air. He's not defeating the Hydra. It has now gotten up to 8 heads by the time he's done, and he runs out of the swamp, takes off. And the Hydra, now an 8-headed, super poisonous giant snake, slithers back into its watery den, chuckling to itself. And Hercules is sitting around the campfire that night. Aeolus isn't talking much. He fixes dinner and just sits there. You can tell Hercules is in a bad mood, probably doesn't want to talk. And so Aeolus sits there doing what any kid would do with a campfire. He pokes with the stick catches fire, blows it out, and watches it glow red. Sticks in the fire, pulls it out, blows it out, watches it glow red. And that's what gives Hercules an idea. And he says to Aeolus, get a good night's sleep. In the morning, you are going to help me kill a snake for good this time. So the morning comes. Hercules rises, sharpens his sword. Aeolus rises and lights 2 torches. And they both take a deep breath and charge into the swamp. And sure enough, the Hydra comes at them again. It lunges at Hercules, and he slices off its head. But before its head can grow back twice, Aeolus jumps in, shoves the torch, the burning torch, into the wounded neck of the Hydra, and cauterizes it, burns it shut, so that no head can grow. And then he jumps back, so Hercules can go after head. And Hercules spends the entire afternoon fighting the snake, Aeolus running out to get breaths of air, and then running back in, and head by head, stump by stump, finally they slay the Hydra. And this has a couple of long-term effects for Hercules' life. Because as Aeolus beats it out of the swamp for the last time for his final breath of air to start cooking next dinner, Hercules dips each of his arrows in the pool of blood coming out of the several stumps from the Hydra. And in fact, he collects a bunch of extra blood in an empty wineskin, because he realized that if the very breath of the Hydra was so poisonous, its blood must be poisonous. And sure enough, from that day forward, Hercules' arrows were so poisonous that even a tiny scratch from one of his arrows would kill you immediately. That was one of the long-term effects. The other long-term effect is that years later, when Hercules finally finished his 10th labor and he was finally free from King Eurystheus' tyranny, Eurystheus called him out and accused him of cheating, because he said it was Hercules who was supposed to kill the Hydra, but really it was Aeolus who killed the Hydra, because Aeolus was the one who kept the heads from growing back. So to make up for cheating, Hercules had to do 2 more labors. So that's why if you go to look up the labors of Hercules, you'll find he serves 12 labors, not 10. And so that's the story of Hercules and of the Hydra. And that brings us to Pegasus. Not a monster, but definitely a creature from Greek myth. Now, as we go to Pegasus on Stellarium, you'll notice Pegasus is upside down. So when you look at the constellation Pegasus, it's kind of hard to make out, is that really a horse? The artwork in Stellarium helps a little bit, helps you visualize it, and you'll see it's upside down. But if you're ever looking at the constellations, if you're ever looking at the night sky and you're feeling bad because you are looking at all of these dots and the lines connecting them, and you really don't see a Pegasus, you don't see a horse, you don't see a scorpion. If you're feeling bad because you can't see the picture, remember the wise words of my middle school science teacher, Mr. Marfia, who told us about the constellations, and then when we were confused, he told us another important fact about the ancient Greeks. they were known for making some very, very strong wine. And he figured that is a good part of why they were able to see pictures in the sky after drinking enough of that. But Pegasus. We've all seen Pegasus. It shows up in logos, it shows up in cartoons, winged horses. My girls love the winged horses in My Little Pony. However, in Greek myth, there were not many winged horses. There was one winged horse named Pegasus, a beautiful snow white horse with wings that came from a very, very gross beginning. And so before we can talk about Pegasus, we have to talk about the Gorgon sisters. And the most famous Gorgon sister of them all, which is Medusa. Now, the Gorgon sisters were famed for the beauty. They were beautiful women to start with. However, those beautiful women managed to offend the goddess Minerva, Athena in ancient Greek. And the thing to know is that when the gods punish you, they don't do an eye for an eye. They do an eye for your entire head. They go overboard with any punishment. So Medusa offended Athena, so Athena punished Medusa and her two sisters who weren't even involved just because they were her sisters. And since they were proud of their beauty, well, she would take their beauty away. But she didn't just make them ugly, she made them hideous. Their skin got covered in bronze scales. Their teeth grew into long, snaggly fangs. Their claws, their fingernails grew into long, savage claws. Metal wings sprouted from their back, and their hair was replaced with writhing masses of snakes. And the three Gorgon sisters were so ugly that to look at them would turn you to stone. You see Medusa in movies and cartoons, and she's usually using magic eye beams to turn people to stone. Not in the original story. She just fell out of the ugly tree and hit every single branch on the way down, and she was so hideous that looking at her would turn you to stone. So Medusa and her sisters fled and went away to an island that nobody could find, just so they could be left alone and not harm anybody. That's my way of looking at it. Some people look at it, oh, the monster going to its death. It's like, no, these three women, they're like, oh no, we're turning people to stone. We're getting out of here. But people didn't leave them alone. And hero after hero managed to find that island. And this island is covered with statues of men who are turned to stone because they can't leave these three Gorgon sisters alone. They're out in the middle of nowhere, literal nowhere, and still man after man shows up, hassling them, getting turned into stone. Which brings us to Perseus. Perseus is yet another son of Zeus, and he's not as powerful as Hercules, but he is powerful. Now, Hercules was lucky. Hercules got to be raised in a palace. Perseus, not so much. His mother was a princess too. But when the king realized that his daughter was pregnant, and there was a prophecy that someday that son would kill him and take over as king, the king got creative and got rid of the baby and his daughter. But because Perseus was a son of Zeus, he didn't dare actually kill Perseus. So he thought he'd let the sea do it. He put Perseus and his wife, Danae, in a box, floated the box out to sea, so it would be Neptune, king of the seas, who killed Perseus, not him. Neptune was not stupid. He was not going to get involved in this mess and have his brother mad at him. So Neptune sent the waves to carefully carry the box to safety. And Perseus was adopted by a fisherman. A fisherman took in both him and his mother. And he grew up poor, dirt poor. And the king of that island, Polydectes, wanted to marry Perseus' mother and knew that Perseus was going to stand in the way because Danae did not want to marry him. So Polydectes tricked Perseus. Perseus was young, a little bit stupid when it came to his pride, and Polydectes goaded Perseus into promising to do any one job that the king gave him. And the king gave him the job of bringing back the head of Medusa. And it was a death mission. Perseus was not going to make it. None of these great heroes had come back. Certainly the son of a fisherman was not going to be able to do it. But Jupiter saw what was happening, and he sent two of his favorites, Mercury and Minerva, the god of tricksters and the goddess of wisdom, down to give one of his other children a hand. And so Mercury and Minerva showed up, and they gave Perseus 4 gifts. They gave him a pair of sandals. They gave him a sword. They gave him a helmet, and they gave him a shield. The sandals were Mercury sandals, and they were winged, and he could fly through the air at high speeds with it. The sword was Athena's sword, and it could cut through rock. It was a Minerva sword. The helmet actually belonged to Pluto, god of the dead, and it could turn Perseus invisible when he wore it. And the bronze shield was also Minerva's, and it was polished to a mere finish. And Minerva let him know that if he looked at Medusa through the reflection in the shield, not directly at her, he could view her safely. So all he had to do was fly to this unfindable island, which he did manage to find, and get into a fight with a monster while not looking directly at the monster, only looking through the reflection of a shield. Piece of cake. He flies off. He does it. He lands on the island, but he doesn't have a great battle with Medusa. He finds her while she's asleep. She and her 2 sisters are asleep. He walks up, using the reflection of the shield, and slice, cuts off her head. And in the picture that goes with that constellation, you can see him holding her head in his hand. And the other hand is that shield. And he has the sword, the sandals, and the helmet. And he flies off with her head. But as her head falls to the ground and blood spouts out, it's not just blood that comes out of the stump of her neck. Pegasus. That is where Pegasus comes from. Out of the neck of this once beautiful woman, now turned into a horrible monster, sprouts this beautiful, beautiful horse that flies off and becomes a thing of legend. And that is the origin of Pegasus. Now, the last hero I'm going to talk about, the last hero in monster pairing, is Scorpius and Orion. But as I'm getting started there, I want to point out all the constellation names I'm using tonight come from the Greek and the Roman. And that's because that Western European way of looking at things dominates a lot of books and dominates science, including the science of astronomy. However, all the different cultures through all the ages have also looked up at the sky. And if we focus on Antares, which is visible in the night sky on a clear night, it's not clear over here in Madison, but if you focus on Antares, it's one of the brightest stars. It's actually a binary star. It's 2 stars. It is in the constellation Scorpius. The Maori, in New Zealand, when they looked up in the sky, they saw Antares too, but they didn't call it Scorpius. They called it Rehua, the chief of the stars, chief of their gods. The ancient Babylonians, they saw Antares, and to them it represented the scorpion goddess Ishara. The Egyptians, they saw and they called it their scorpion goddess. Interesting that both cultures had scorpion goddesses, Serket. And in Arabic, the name for Antares translates as heart of the scorpion. Pause. I would encourage you, look into the Greek myths, look into the Roman myths. To be honest, you learn the Greek, you've also learned the Romans, you just need to name swap. But all these other cultures have some amazing stories. And those stories, a lot of times, have symbols that appear in the night sky. And I encourage you to look at Native American, Aztec, Egyptian, all these different cultures all throughout history. Learn their stories, and you can also learn about what they saw up in the sky. But for now, since I'm focusing on the Greeks and the Romans, we'll talk about the constellation Scorpius and the constellation Orion. And these two are a pair. because Orion is another demigod, sort of like Hercules, except for Orion, instead of being a son of Zeus, Orion is a son of Neptune, god of the sea. Orion was a giant, and he was a hunter, and he was famous for his ability to hunt. And one of the things that was a handy skill that he got from his father is Orion could run across the waves. He didn't need a boat. He didn't need to go around any lakes or any seas. He could just run across them. And he was such a great hunter. And because he was a giant and a demigod, he got the privilege, eventually, of hunting with Diana, the goddess of the hunt. And Diana loved hunting with Orion, and they got along greatly. And Orion was so proud of his ability to hunt, so proud of the fact that he got to hunt with Diana, that he bragged. And bragging in Greek and Roman myth is the biggest of no-nos. Pride goeth before the fall. And in particular, we're going to call this particular type of pride by the Greek term hubris. And hubris is also known as overweening pride, overwhelming pride. Very often it shows up in a hero or character being so proud that they'll compare themselves to the gods or will challenge the gods. In Orion's case, his hubris led him to brag that he was such a great hunter, he was going to hunt down and kill every single animal on the earth. Well, Terra, the goddess of the earth, heard this. She didn't like this much, so she sent an animal that Orion wasn't going to be able to hunt, a giant scorpion. And Orion the hunter became the hunted, and the scorpion struck him down, killed him. He was not immortal. He was just giant and powerful. And so Orion was dead, and the scorpion scuttled off. But Diana was heartbroken that she had lost her hunting companion, and she begged her father Jupiter to put Orion in the sky so that she could still see him. And Jupiter agreed. He did it. But I had the feeling that Jupiter didn't really approve of Diana's relationship with Orion because he also put Scorpius, the scorpion, in the sky as well. And the way that he arranged them, Scorpius is forever chasing Orion through the night sky. So as Orion moves through the sky with the evenings and the seasons, Scorpius is trailing behind. So Diana's hunting companion gets to be in the sky for eternity, but he also gets to spend eternity being chased down by the same monster that killed him.
For some reason, can't find Orion tonight, but Orion is a winter constellation, so we're okay with that.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
And the most famous part of Orion is Orion's belt. It's one of the ones that I can usually spot easier than all the others. So yeah, spend some time on Stellarium and you'll be able to find Orion. And once you can recognize him, you can watch him be chased across the sky by a scorpion. And there are many gods, many heroes that appear in the sky, and I invite you to learn the stories and learn how to find them in the sky.
And I apologize for not finding Orion tonight, but as I said, I had to take off, and you can do this in Stellarium. It's really cool. You could take off the horizon, and you can see some of those winter constellations a little bit better. Well, I'm going to share my screen one more time because I do want you guys to be able to go out into the night sky, and let me get past the craft for a second, go out into the night sky and do some constellation viewing tonight. So there are lots of great free apps out there that you can use in order to view the constellations. You may not have Stellarium, for example, with you, but there's lots of other great apps out there. Some of them are free, some of them are not free, and we're just gonna go over a few of them that are out there. One of my favorites is Skyview Lite. It's an app. It's available for both Apple and Android devices, and it's free, which is why I love it. But it is really good in the sense of you just use your phone, you put it up to the sky, and it helps you see what's in the sky right on your phone. The great thing about this is it doesn't cloud your screen with lots of different constellations and lots of different things. It only shows you the major stars and the major constellations, which can be a good and a bad thing. It's great in the sense if you don't want to be overwhelmed. It's bad in the sense if you do want to be overwhelmed. And so it's a good app. It's, as I said, free for both Apple as well as Android devices. If you want something a little more intense, StarWalk 2 is another app. It is free for Android users. It is not free for Apple users, unfortunately, but it does something similar to the previous one, but it has some other features as well. It actually uses your phone sensors and GPS to find the exact positions of objects in real time. It has a visible tonight button, which tells you which objects are actually visible at your location. It has a what's new section, so upcoming events. It also has a red light mode, so it doesn't screw with your night vision. The other app does as well. But as I said, it isn't free for Apple users, and it does have ads for Android users. A third one that I just want to point out is SkySafari. Again, it's another one that's free for Android users, but not free for Apple users, unfortunately. But it is really cool in the sense that you can use your phone, your voice on your phone, to actually help find things. So you can say, find Jupiter, and it'll help you find things. And it's got a big database of stars, planets, and other objects. And you can you cannot upgrade this app to other features, but if you had a telescope, it can help you find things in the sky with a telescope. And so it's another great app. Check them out. They're really good if you want to help find some of those stories in the sky that we talked about tonight. You can also get Stellarium on your phone, but it isn't free when it's on your phone. So it does cost $3 for both Apple as well as Android devices. There's a plus version that's going to give you even more. But if it's on your phone, it's not free. But if you download it off the internet and put it on, for example, a laptop, it is free, which is great. And so the program that we were using tonight is called Stellarium. It's a free program. You just download it from the web onto your laptop and explore it. It's great for telling you all sorts of constellations, not just in the Western, so Greeks, Romans, but also there's Navajo, there's Ojibwe for our native people in Michigan, lots of other cultures and lots of other constellations that are out there. So it's great for that. One thing that I do want you guys to be aware of tonight is one of the peak times to actually view the Perseids. So remember, John talked about Perseus tonight. The Perseids meteor shower is actually tonight. It's one of the peak nights. It appears because the Earth passes through the debris left by the comet Swift-Tuttle. And last night, tonight, as well as tomorrow, are the peak times to really see it. That's when you're going to see the most meteors. You could see one, for example, every minute for a whole hour. What you want to do when you look for this, though, you want to go to the darkest possible location, find a comfy chair, maybe some bug spray. If you're my son, snacks. You definitely want those snacks. Wait for about 30 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes to really get your eyes adjusted to the dark. You do not need binoculars or telescopes to see this. You can see it with just your eyes. And I would really encourage people to go out there. Some people say it's best in the early morning hours, but you can see it anytime as long as it gets dark. So I would encourage people to go see the Perseids near Perseus. And if you like John's stories tonight, he has a Facebook page as well as a YouTube channel that he posts things on with some more stories. So if you want to learn some more stories from John, this will be, if you're subscribed with us with Zoom, this will be on the Zoom follow-up email. So don't worry about that. And some things that are coming up with both the library as well as the Institute. So next Wednesday, we are posting our next Family Science Night Challenge. Fairy houses, bug bungalows, and toad abodes. Can you build them, and will they come? So that's next Wednesday night. The Hastings Library is doing a story time in September. September 11th. It's on a Friday. We're switching our story times to Fridays again. We're doing another virtual stroll with nature in September on the 12th. It's a Saturday. All stroll with natures are switched to Saturdays now. We're going to talk about foxes. Berry County Builds is actually going viral. And so Berry County Builds is something that we tend to do in Berry County with the Hastings Public Library, as well as many other organizations, including Pierce Cedar Creek Institute. And they're going to do an activity a day that you can pick up at the Hastings Public Library. There's also some more science story times that are coming up, as well as story to go packets and book bundles at the Hastings Public Library, and their summer library program is still going on. So there's lots of great programs that are going on. Just because it's the end of summer doesn't mean there aren't great things going on. So go look up into the sky, go see what's happening, and enjoy the night sky. I hope you guys learned things. I want to thank John very much for his knowledge tonight and all his great stories. Thank you, John.
Denada, I was happy I could come.
All right. And If you have, I don't think I see any questions or comments in the chat, but if you do have those, feel free to send those on either to myself. My email is holstee, HOLSTEE @cedarcreekinstitute.org. I can forward those on to John as well. But thank you guys for sharing your evening with us.